Hi there, welcome to Jville Stories. Please subscribe to my channel and turn on the post notifications to get updated when interesting stories are uploaded. Thank you. The villagers of Amur had always prided themselves on their sense of community, but for Mr. Ben, community was a luxury he had never truly known. To them, he was a pitiable figure, a man who barely existed, let alone mattered. The harsh whispers followed him wherever he went. "Look at him," women in the market would say, their voices dripping with disdain as he trudged past in his tattered clothes. Ben the lazy, forever chasing dreams that will never come true. Ben's days were marked by the same lonely routine. At the crack of dawn, while others tended their farms or opened their shops, Ben would disappear into the thick forest surrounding Amur, a sack slung over his shoulder and a pickaxe in hand. No one knew what he did there, and no one cared to ask. The few who noticed assumed he was wasting time, digging for firewood or perhaps hoping to stumble upon some hidden treasure, a fool's errand, they called it. What the villagers didn't know was the depth of Ben's struggles. Born the only child of a poor widow, he had spent his youth caring for his ailing mother, sacrificing his education and any hope of a better life. When she passed away, leaving him nothing but the dilapidated hut they had called home, the weight of poverty became his alone to bear. The village elders, who should have offered guidance, turned their backs on him. "He's cursed," they muttered. "No man his age should be so useless." But Ben wasn't useless. He was resourceful and driven, though his efforts often went unnoticed. Each day he ventured deep into the forest, driven by a hope he couldn't entirely explain. The land had always spoken to him in ways it didn't to others. As a boy, he had wandered the woods with his mother, who told him stories of hidden riches and forgotten blessings buried beneath the earth. "The land provides for those who believe in it," she would say. Her words stayed with him, a flicker of hope in the darkness of his circumstances. The laughter of children echoed behind him as he walked toward the forest one morning, their cruel taunts stinging like nettles. "Hey, lazy Ben," one boy called. "What will you bring back today?" "A sack full of nothing." Ben clenched his fists but didn't respond. He had learned long ago that silence was his greatest shield. Words would only feed their cruelty, and he had no strength left for battles he couldn't win. Instead, he disappeared into the trees, his heart heavy with loneliness and determination. That evening, as the village gathered around the market square, sharing stories and laughter, Ben returned quietly to his hut. He sat by the faint glow of his oil lamp, the day's work weighing on his body. His hands were blistered, his clothes caked with dirt, but he didn't complain. He knew that what he sought would take time, perhaps a lifetime. And though the world saw him as nothing more than a poor broken man, Ben believed in his heart that one day they would see him differently. But for now, he was content with his solitude. The world outside was cruel, but in the quiet of his tiny hut, Ben could dream. Life in Amur revolved around work and community. Farmers rose with the sun, traders filled the market with chatter, and the village square bustled with life. Yet in this close-knit community, Mr. Ben was an outsider. His absence from their shared routines only deepened their contempt. "Do you know what I saw today, Martha, the village gossip?" exclaimed one afternoon as she sold her yams in the market. Her loud, dramatic voice drew a crowd. That man Ben, wandering around the forest again with his rusty tools. What could he possibly be looking for? Firewood, a wife, she cackled, and the crowd erupted in laughter. "He's wasting his life," added John, her husband, who prided himself on his flourishing cassava farm. "While we're sweating to feed our families, he's out there chasing shadows. No wonder he's cursed with poverty." This sentiment was shared by almost everyone in Amur. To the villagers, Ben's poverty wasn't just bad luck, it was proof of his inadequacy. They had no sympathy for a man they believed had squandered his potential. When Ben passed through the village square with his sack slung over his shoulder, children would point and sing cruel songs. "Lazy Ben with a broken hoe, to the forest he will go. He'll come back with a sack of air, because there's nothing for him there." The elders of the village, who sat under the baobab tree sharing stories and chewing cola nuts, would shake their heads in disapproval as he walked by. A man his age should be building something, anything, said Elder Paul, the oldest and most respected member of the community. Not wandering aimlessly like a vulture. Ben heard these words every day. They stung, but he never showed it. He kept his head down and his steps steady, retreating into the forest where the whispers of the trees were kinder than the voices of his neighbors. Despite his outward calm, there were moments when the weight of their ridicule became too much to bear. One evening, after returning from the forest, Ben sat by the small stream near his hut, his hands trembling as he washed the dirt from his face. He stared at his reflection in the water, seeing the weariness etched into his features. "Am I truly worthless?" he whispered to the still surface. His voice cracked with emotion. For years he had carried the burden of their scorn, but the loneliness it brought was unbearable. He longed for companionship, for someone to believe in him, even if he had nothing to offer. But no one in Amur would give him that. To them, he was invisible unless he was the subject of their mockery. As the sun set over the village, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ben retreated to his hut. Outside, the villagers gathered for their nightly storytelling and laughter. Their voices carried through the evening air, a constant reminder that he did not belong. Inside his hut, Ben lit a small oil lamp and pulled out an old, tattered notebook. It was his most prized possession, filled with sketches and calculations about the forest. The villagers thought he wandered aimlessly, but Ben had a purpose. Deep in the forest, beneath an unassuming hill, lay a secret that no one in Amur could have imagined, a secret that might one day change everything. For now, though, Ben was content to let them laugh. Their scorn would mean nothing when the time was right. Ben had discovered the hill many years ago during one of his long treks through the forest. It was an unremarkable mound, covered in wild grass and thorny shrubs, but something about it had caught his attention. The earth beneath it felt different, denser, heavier, as though it was holding a secret. Intrigued, he had begun to dig, working tirelessly with his crude tools. It wasn't until months later that he struck something extraordinary. His pickaxe hit a vein of gold embedded in the rock, its glittering surface shining even in the dim light of his lantern. Ben's heart raced. He had found a treasure that could change his life and the lives of everyone in Amur. But as the initial excitement wore off, reality set in. Ben knew nothing about mining or selling gold. He had no education, no connections, and no way to extract the wealth hidden beneath the hill. If he told the villagers, they would likely claim it as their own, leaving him with nothing. The years of ridicule had taught him that trust was a dangerous thing. So Ben kept his discovery a secret. He continued to work on the hill in silence, digging small amounts of gold and hiding them in a battered wooden chest beneath the floorboards of his hut. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. Then one day, while wandering the edge of the forest, he encountered a stranger. The man, dressed in fine clothes and carrying a leather briefcase, was clearly from the city. He introduced himself as Mr. Alfred, a businessman who had come to Amur looking for potential investments. Ben hesitated at first, wary of revealing his secret to an outsider. But something about Alfred's demeanor, his calm voice, his genuine curiosity put him at ease. After much deliberation, Ben led him to the hill and showed him the gold. Alfred was stunned. This is incredible," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "Do you realize what you found? This isn't just a gold deposit, it's a mine, a rich one. With the right resources, this could make millions." Ben nodded quietly. "I know," he said, "but I don't have the means to do anything with it. That's why I need someone like you." Over the next few months, Ben and Alfred struck a deal. Alfred would handle the mining operations, bringing in equipment and workers from the city. In return, Ben would receive a substantial share of the profits, enough to ensure his financial security for the rest of his life. The arrangement was kept strictly confidential. Alfred understood Ben's desire for discretion, and so the gold mine began to operate, hidden deep in the forest where no one in Amur would suspect. The wealth began to flow steadily, but Ben's life in the village remained unchanged. He still wore his tattered clothes and lived in his small, decrepit hut. The villagers continued to mock him, oblivious to the fortune that lay beneath their feet. For Ben, the secrecy wasn't just about protecting his wealth. It was also about preserving his dignity. He didn't want their kindness if it was only motivated by money. He wanted to know if they could ever see him as more than a failure. But as the weeks turned into months, the loneliness began to weigh on him. He had everything he had ever dreamed of: security, independence, power, but it came at a cost. The villagers' scorn cut deeper now, knowing that he could change their lives if he wanted to. Yet he kept silent, waiting for a moment that felt right, a moment that seemed farther away with each passing day. Amur was once a thriving village, known for its fertile lands and hardworking people. Farmers reaped bountiful harvests, traders brought in goods from nearby towns, and laughter filled the air. But seasons changed, and the blessings of the land seemed to wither away. Drought gripped the village, turning lush fields into barren dust. Rivers that once overflowed with water dwindled into narrow streams. The people of Amur, proud and self-reliant, began to struggle. John, the once prosperous cassava farmer, stood in his field staring at the cracked, sun-baked soil. "How can I feed my family with this?" he muttered, despair tightening his throat. His wife, Martha, tried to comfort him, but her words rang hollow. She too felt the pang of hunger and worry in her belly. The village square, once lively with trade and chatter, now felt like a ghost town. Stall after stall sat empty, traders unable to buy or sell, left for greener pastures. Children cried from hunger, their mothers trying to soothe them with thin gruel. The elders, who once spoke with wisdom and certainty, now gathered under the baobab tree in silence, their faces drawn with worry. "We must do something," Elder Paul finally said, breaking the heavy quiet. "This village cannot survive like this." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. "But what can we do?" one farmer asked. "The rains won't come and the traders won't return. We have nothing left." In their desperation, the villagers turned their thoughts to Ben. "He spends all his time in the forest," John said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Maybe he's hoarding something out there: food, water, money. He must be hiding something while the rest of us suffer." Martha nodded vigorously. "Yes, how else could he survive on his own? He never helps with the farming or trading, but he never seems to starve. We should confront him." That evening, a group of villagers gathered at Ben's hut. They knocked loudly on his door, their voices sharp and demanding. "Ben," John shouted, "come out. We need to talk." Inside Ben's side, he had anticipated this moment but hoped it would come later, when the mine had produced enough wealth to truly help the village. Nevertheless, he opened the door, meeting their accusing glares with quiet resolve. "What do you want?" he asked softly. "What do we want?" Martha snapped. "We want to know how you survive while the rest of us are starving. Do you have food hidden in this hut? Money you've been keeping from us?" Ben shook his head. "I have nothing to hide," he said. "I live as simply as all of you." "Liar!" John snarled, pushing past him into the hut. He rummaged through Ben's meager belongings, finding only a few old tools, a threadbare blanket, and the small chest beneath the floorboards. His heart leapt with hope, thinking he'd found Ben's secret stash, but when he opened it, all he saw was a pile of dull rocks. "Rocks!" John spat, throwing them on the floor. "You're a fool, Ben, a useless fool." The crowd outside laughed bitterly, their frustration turning into open contempt. "He's not hiding anything," John announced as he stormed out. "Just his own stupidity." As the villagers dispersed, Ben sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the rocks scattered across the floor. They weren't just any rocks. They were samples of the gold he had mined, dull on the outside but rich within. If only they knew, he thought. If only they could see past their anger and desperation. But he said nothing. Instead, he gathered the rocks and placed them back in the chest, locking it with trembling hands. The villagers' words echoed in his mind long into the night. Useless fool. The insult stung more deeply than usual. Even though he could change their lives, their cruelty kept him silent. As the night deepened, Ben sat alone by the window, staring out at the dark forest. He could hear the faint cries of hungry children and the murmurs of worried parents. A part of him longed to share his secret to end their suffering. But another part, the part that remembered their years of mockery, held him back. "They won't understand," he whispered to himself. Not yet, and so Ben remained silent, even as the village fell deeper into despair. The drought persisted, draining Amur of its joy and hope. days turned into weeks, and the once proud villagers became shadows of themselves. Hunger gnawed at their bellies and despair clouded their minds. Yet, amid the suffering, the annual harvest festival approached, a time meant for celebration, unity, and gratitude. But what could they celebrate now, with their fields barren and their stomachs empty? Despite their struggles, the villagers decided to hold the festival. "It's tradition," Elder Paul said. "Perhaps it will lift our spirits and bring back the rains." But beneath their resolve was another unspoken reason. They needed someone to blame. And who better than Ben, the outcast who seemed to walk through life untouched by their hardships? Preparations for the festival were meager. The usual feast of roasted yams, fresh vegetables, and spiced goat meat was replaced by thin bowls of porridge and a few handfuls of dried fish. The vibrant decorations of past years were reduced to faded cloths and wilting flowers. Yet the villagers clung to the ritual, hoping it would distract them from their suffering. When the day of the festival arrived, the village square buzzed with activity. Women dressed in their best, though many had to patch and mend old clothes. Children, too hungry to run and play, sat quietly by their parents. The men, once strong and proud, stood in clusters, their faces lined with worry. As the festival began, Elder Paul stepped forward to address the crowd. "My people," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "we have faced great hardships this year, but we are strong and we will endure. Tonight, let us come together as a community and find hope in each other." The crowd murmured in agreement, but there was an undercurrent of bitterness. The drought had tested their bonds and many felt the strain. Among them, one name lingered on their lips: Ben. "Why is he even here?" Martha whispered to her neighbor, pointing toward Ben, who sat at the edge of the gathering. "He does nothing for this village." "He's cursed," her neighbor replied, "always digging in that forest while the rest of us suffer." The whispers spread like wildfire, and soon the crowd's attention turned toward Ben. Someone no one would admit who shouted, "Lazy Ben! What do you have to say for yourself?" Ben, startled by the sudden attention, looked up. The villagers' faces were a mixture of anger and desperation. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, John stepped forward. "Let's put him on trial," John said, his loud and commanding. "We've all suffered because of him. He hoards while we starve. Let him answer for his actions." The crowd erupted in agreement. They dragged Ben to the center of the square, surrounding him like vultures. Elder Paul hesitated, but the pressure of the crowd forced him to comply. "Ben," he said solemnly, "you stand before the village accused of selfishness and laziness. What do you have to say?" Ben looked around at the faces he had known his entire life, faces that had mocked him, scorned him, and now condemned him. His heart ached with a mixture of sorrow and anger. He wanted to shout the truth, to tell them about the gold and the wealth it could bring. But as he met their eyes, he saw only greed and malice. "I have done nothing wrong," he said quietly. "I live as simply as the rest of you." "Liar!" Martha shouted. "You've been hiding something. We all know it." The crowd demanded punishment. Some suggested banishment, others humiliation. In the end, they chose the cruelest form of justice, a public shaming. They stripped him of his dignity, pelting him with rotten food and jeering insults. Ben stood silently, his shoulders hunched but his spirit unbroken. As the crowd finally dispersed, Elder Paul approached him. "Ben," he said softly, "I'm sorry for what happened tonight, but the people are desperate. You must understand." Ben nodded, though his heart felt heavy. He returned to his hut, his clothes soiled and his pride shattered. That night, as he lay on his tin mat, he whispered to himself, "They don't deserve it. They don't deserve the truth." But even as he said the words, he felt a pang of guilt. The village's suffering was real, and he had the power to end it. Yet he couldn't forget their years of cruelty. Perhaps, he thought, they must first learn the value of kindness. The festival ended with no rain, no joy, and no resolution. And in his small, lonely hut, Ben waited for the day when the truth would no longer be a burden he carried alone. The morning after the festival, Amir was quiet. The air was thick with regret, though few villagers would admit it. In the aftermath of their anger, they were left only with the hollow feeling that their cruelty toward Ben had accomplished nothing. Yet life in the village trudged on. The rains still hadn't come, the fields were still barren, and the hunger gnawed deeper every day. Ben, meanwhile, carried on with his solitary routine. He left his hut at dawn, his tools in hand, and ventured into the forest as always. But this time, something was different. His steps were heavier, his heart burdened by the events of the festival. Though he had grown used to the villagers' ridicule over the years, their public humiliation of him had cut deeper than he was willing to admit. For the first time, he wondered if his silence was a mistake. Deep in the forest, Ben arrived at the hidden hill where his secret gold mine lay. He ran his fingers over the cool, hard rock, tracing the veins of gold that glimmered faintly in the sunlight filtering through the trees. This hill had been his salvation, his one source of hope. But now it felt like a prison. What good is wealth, he murmured to himself, if it can't bring peace? As he stood there, lost in thought, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Ben turned sharply, his heart racing. He rarely encountered anyone in the forest, and the thought of someone discovering his secret filled him with dread. Emerging from the trees was Mr. Alfred, the city businessman who had partnered with Ben to mine the gold. Ben, Alfred called, a broad smile on his face. I've been looking for you. Ben's shoulders relaxed slightly, though he was still on edge. What brings you here? He asked, his voice cautious. Alfred gestured toward the hill. I wanted to discuss the next phase of the mining operation. The first shipments of gold have already brought in substantial profits. With the right investments, we can expand even further. Ben nodded, though his enthusiasm was muted. That's good, he said. But why come all the way to Amur? Alfred's expression softened. Because I wanted to see you, Ben. I've worked with many partners, but none like you. Your integrity, your vision, it's rare. I wanted to thank you personally. Before Ben could respond, the sound of rustling leaves drew their attention. From behind a nearby tree, John and Martha emerged, their faces pale with shock. They had been foraging in the forest when they overheard the conversation, and now they stood frozen, staring at the gleaming gold embedded in the hill. Gold, Martha whispered, her voice trembling. Ben, this is yours? Alfred frowned, clearly annoyed by the intrusion. Who are these people? Ben sighed, his secret now exposed. They're villagers, he said quietly. And yes, the gold is mine. John stumbled forward, his hand shaking. All this time, he stammered, you've had this treasure, and you said nothing? The bitterness in his voice stung, but Ben met his gaze evenly. Would you have believed me? He asked. Would you have treated me any differently, or would you have taken it from me like you've taken everything else? Maha fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. We were wrong, she sobbed. All those years we mocked you, humiliated you. We didn't know. Please, Ben, forgive us. Alfred, sensing the tension, stepped forward. Ben, do you want me to handle this? He asked. I can arrange for the mine to be secured. But Ben shook his head. No, he said firmly. This is my burden to bear. Turning back to John and Martha, he spoke with a calm that masked the storm in his heart. You mocked me when I had nothing, and now you beg for my mercy because I have something you want. Wealth isn't the cure for cruelty. If you truly regret what you've done, prove it, not with words, but with actions. John and Martha nodded, their faces streaked with shame. We'll tell the village, John said. We'll make them understand. As they hurried back toward Amur, Ben remained by the hill, his thoughts heavy. The truth was out now, but it brought him no comfort. He had spent years dreaming of this moment, imagining the satisfaction of proving his worth to the people who had scorned him. Yet all he felt was emptiness. They don't deserve this, he muttered. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about what they deserved. It was about what he could live with. That evening, the village buzzed with the news of Ben's gold mine. Crowds gathered at his hut not to mock him, but to beg for forgiveness. They pleaded for his help, their voices filled with desperation. For the first time, Ben stood at the center of their attention not as an outcast, but as a man of power. Yet he felt more alone than ever. The next morning, the village square was unusually quiet, save for the hushed whispers of people gathered in small clusters. Word of Ben's secret gold mine had spread like wildfire. For the first time, Amur was united in a singular emotion, not scorn, but shame. By midday, a group of villagers made their way to Ben's hut. They came carrying gifts, baskets of dried fish, bowls of cassava flour, and palm wine. It was a stark contrast to the rotten food they had thrown at him during the festival. At the head of the group stood Elder Paul, his normally steady voice trembling with guilt. "Ben," he began, his gaze fixed on the ground, "we have wronged you. For years we judged you, mocked you, and treated you as less than one of us. We were blind to your worth, blind to your struggles, and now knowing what we know, we are ashamed." Ben stood in the doorway of his hut, his expression unreadable. He crossed his arms and said nothing, letting the weight of Elder Paul's words hang in the air. John, standing behind the elder, stepped forward. "We were fools, Ben," he said, his voice cracked as he spoke, his hands shaking. "All this time we thought you were worthless, but you're the one who could save us." At that, the villagers erupted in pleas. "Please forgive us," cried Martha, tears streaming down her face. "We need your help, Ben. The village is dying. You could save us all." Their words struck a chord deep within Ben. He had dreamed of this moment for years, of the villagers recognizing his worth, apologizing for their cruelty. But now that it was here, it felt hollow. Their regret was not born of genuine remorse, but of desperation. If not for the gold, they would still see him as lazy Ben, the outcast. "What makes you think I owe you anything?" Ben asked, his voice quiet but firm. The crowd fell silent, the weight of his question cutting through their pleas. "For years you treated me as if I were less than human. Now, because I have something you want, you come here with gifts and apologies. Do you think wealth changes who I am?" The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared to speak, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Finally, Elder Paul stepped forward again. "Ben, you're right. We were cruel, and we have no excuse for the way we treated you. But if there's any part of you that still cares for this village, please have mercy on us." Ben stared at the elder for a long moment. The memory of their laughter, their taunts, and their scorn flashed through his mind. But so did the faces of the children, hungry and crying, and the barren fields that once fed them all. The weight of his fortune pressed heavily on his shoulders. "Mercy," Ben repeated, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You asked for mercy, but where was your mercy when I had nothing?" The villagers looked down, their shame palpable. Ben sighed. "I don't do this for you," he said finally. "I do this for the children, for the land, for the future of Amur. But know this, kindness should never depend on wealth. You all need to learn that." Relief swept through the crowd, and some of the villagers wept openly. But Ben raised a hand, silencing their gratitude. "If I help you," he continued, "there will be conditions. This village must change. No more cruelty, no more mockery. Treat every person with respect, regardless of their wealth or status." "Do you understand?" The villagers nodded eagerly, their faces earnest. "We'll change," John promised. "We'll do better." Ben didn't believe them, not entirely. But for the sake of the village, he was willing to try. "Then let's begin," he said. That evening, the villagers gathered in the square as Ben outlined his plan. He would use the profits from the gold mine to rebuild Amur, to dig new wells, buy seeds and tools for the farmers, and restore the market. But he made it clear that this was not a gift. "This is your second chance," he told them. "Don't waste it." For the first time, the villagers saw Ben not as an outcast, but as a leader. But as they celebrated their newfound hope, Ben couldn't help but feel a lingering sadness. Their gratitude still felt conditional, their remorse tied to their desperation. He wondered if they would ever truly see him for who he was. That night, as the village rejoiced, Ben sat alone in his hut. The chest of gold lay at his feet, a symbol of both his triumph and his burden. He had given the village hope, but he still felt the ache of their past cruelty. "They may respect me now," he murmured to himself, "but will they ever truly care?" As weeks turned into months, the changes in Amur were undeniable. Ben's wealth, carefully managed and distributed, brought the village back to life. New wells were dug, the barren fields were replanted, and the market square once again buzzed with activity. The villagers sang Ben's praises, calling him their savior. But for Ben, the newfound adoration felt hollow, a bitter reminder of how conditional their acceptance had always been. Each day, Ben walked through the village, observing the fruits of his efforts. children laughed and played in the streets, no longer crying from hunger. Farmers like John worked their fields with renewed vigor, their hands steady on plows purchased with Ben's funds. Traders returned to the market, their stalls bursting with goods. Yet, despite the outward joy, Ben couldn't shake the emptiness within him. "Mr. Ben," Martha called one morning as he passed her stall. Her once sharp tongue had softened into honeyed words. "Come, take some yams, the freshest in the market, just for you." Ben shook his head. "No, thank you," he said politely but firmly. Martha's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Don't be shy, you've done so much for us, it's the least I can do." Ben walked away without another word, leaving Martha standing there, her face a mixture of confusion and hurt. He didn't have the energy to pretend. The villagers' kindness, though well-meaning, felt like another weight on his shoulders. They saw him not as a man, but as a source of their salvation, a figure to revere because of what he could provide. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ben sat outside his hut, staring at the darkening sky. The sounds of celebration from the village reached his ears. The villagers were holding a feast to mark the successful planting season. He had been invited, of course, but he had declined. The thought of sitting among them pretending their gratitude erased years of scorn was too much to bear. "You're lonely," the voice startled him. He turned to see Elder Paul standing nearby, his walking stick in hand. The elder's face, lined with age and wisdom, was kind but somber. "What do you want, Elder?" Ben asked, his tone weary. "To talk," Paul said, settling onto a nearby log. "You've done a great thing for this village, Ben. But I can see it's not enough for you." Ben didn't respond immediately. He stared at the ground, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "They don't care about me," he said finally. "Not really. They care about what I can give them." Paul sighed. "You're not entirely wrong. People are often selfish, especially when they're desperate. But that doesn't mean their gratitude isn't real." "Gratitude," Ben scoffed. "They hated me for years. Now, because I have money, they act like I matter." "It's all so shallow," Paul leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Ben, the pain they caused you, no one can take that away. But if you let it consume you, it will only hurt you more. You have the power to change their hearts, to teach them what kindness really means. But that takes time." Ben looked at the elder, his eyes filled with a sorrow too deep for words. "I don't know if I have the strength for that," he said quietly. Paul placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. "Strength isn't about never feeling pain, Ben. It's about enduring it and using it to build something better." That night, Ben lay awake, Paul's words echoing in his mind. He wanted to believe the elder was right, that the villagers could change, that their kindness could one day be genuine. But the scars of their cruelty ran deep, and he wasn't sure if they or he could ever truly heal. The following days passed in a blur. Ben threw himself into his work, overseeing the mining operations and ensuring the village's needs were met. But his heart grew heavier with each passing day. The villagers' smiles, their thanks, their attempts at friendship, it all felt like a performance, a mask hiding their true feelings. One evening, as the mine workers packed up for the day, Alfred approached Ben. "You look tired," the businessman said, concern etched on his face. "Why don't you take a break? Come to the city for a while." "Get away from all this," Ben shook his head. "This is my home," he said. "I can't leave." Alfred hesitated. "Ben, I've worked with a lot of people in my life. I know what it looks like when someone's carrying too much. You've done more for this village than anyone could have expected. Maybe it's time to think about yourself for a change." Ben didn't reply. He knew Alfred was right, but the thought of leaving Amur filled him with guilt. This village had been his entire world, even when it had rejected him. How could he walk away now? As the sun set over the forest, casting long shadows across the land, Ben stood at the edge of the mine, staring down at the gleaming gold that had brought him so much and yet taken so much more. For all his wealth, he felt poorer than ever. The weight of Ben's loneliness pressed harder with each passing day. Despite his immense wealth and the transformation of Amur, he remained an outsider in his own village. The smiles and gratitude of the villagers felt like fleeting moments, shallow and conditional. The gap between him and the people who had mocked him for years was too wide to bridge. The rains had returned, and with them the promise of a good harvest. The village thrived, its market once again bustling with life, its people singing songs of hope and joy. But even as the village prospered, Ben withdrew further into himself. He spent most of his time at the gold mine or in his hut, avoiding the square where the villagers now celebrated the wealth that had come from his efforts. One evening, Elder Paul came to visit him again. The old man leaned heavily on his walking stick, his movements slower than before. He found Ben sitting by the window of his hut, staring out at the distant forest. "Ben," Paul said gently, lowering himself onto a stool, "I can see the pain in your eyes. You've given so much to this village, but you carry the burden alone." "Let them in." Ben didn't turn to face him. "They don't want me," he said quietly. "They want what I can give them. If the gold disappeared tomorrow, so would their kindness." Paul sighed, his heart heavy with sadness. "Perhaps some of them would," he admitted, "but not all. People are flawed, Ben, but they can change. You've already begun to change them, whether you see it or not." Ben shook his head. "It's too late for that," he said. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove I'm worth something. But even now, with all this gold, I still feel empty." Paul placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. "Your worth isn't in the gold, Ben. It's in the good you've done. The children who no longer go to bed hungry, the farmers who now have a future, all of that is because of you." Ben's eyes glistened, but he said nothing. He couldn't shake the feeling that, despite all he had done, he would never truly belong. One morning, the villagers awoke to find Ben's hut empty. His tools were gone, his bed untouched. At first, they thought he had gone to the forest as usual, but as the day wore on, he didn't return. Panic spread through the village. John and a group of men set out to search the forest. They scoured the trails Ben often took, calling his name into the dense trees. Hours passed with no sign of him. Finally, as the sun began to set, they found him. Ben's lifeless body lay at the base of the hill where his gold mine was hidden. His hands were folded across his chest, clutching a small sack of gold. His face was calm, almost peaceful, as though he had finally found the rest that had eluded him in life. The villagers were overcome with grief. John knelt beside Ben's body, tears streaming down his face. "We failed him," he whispered. "Even when he gave us everything, we failed him." They carried Ben's body back to the village, their hearts heavy with regret. The once thriving square fell silent as the villagers gathered to mourn. Elder Paul, his voice trembling with emotion, delivered the eulogy. "Ben was a man of great wealth," he said, his words carrying through the still air. "But his greatest riches were not in the gold he found, but in the kindness he showed to those who did not deserve it. We mocked him, we scorned him, and yet he saved us. Let his life be a lesson to us all that we must learn to see the worth in every person, not because of what they have, but because of who they are." The villagers buried Ben at the foot of the hill, marking his grave with a simple stone. On it, they carved the words, "Here lies Ben, a man who gave everything to a village that gave him nothing. May his sacrifice teach us the value of kindness." In his will, Ben left the gold mine to the village, ensuring its prosperity for generations to come. But the wealth brought them little comfort. The memory of their cruelty haunted them, a reminder of the man they had lost and the price of their actions. Elder Paul often visited Ben's grave, sitting quietly by the stone as he reflected on the life of the man who had been misunderstood and mistreated. "Rest now, Ben," he would say. "You deserved better than we gave you." The story of Ben became a legend in Amur, passed down through generations as a tale of redemption and regret. The villagers vowed never to repeat their mistakes, to treat everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. But for those who had known Ben in life, the weight of their guilt never lifted. No amount of wealth or prosperity could fill the void he had left behind. Years passed and Amur transformed into a prosperous village, a far cry from the barren, struggling community it once was. The gold mine flourished under careful management, bringing wealth not only to the village, but to the surrounding towns as well. Roads were built, schools were constructed, and trade routes thrived. Amur became known as a hub of progress and opportunity. Yet, amid all this prosperity, there remained a quiet sadness that lingered in the hearts of the villagers, a shadow of the man whose sacrifice had made it all possible. Ben's grave at the base of the Golden Hill became a sacred site. The villagers often visited it to pay their respects, leaving offerings of flowers and food. Children were told the story of Kind Ben, the man who had saved their village at great personal cost. The elders made it their mission to ensure that his name was never forgotten. Elder Paul, who had grown frail with age, often sat by Ben's grave, reflecting on the lessons Ben's life had taught them. One day, he gathered the villagers in the square to share his thoughts. "We owe everything to Ben," he began, his voice trembling but resolute. "He gave us not just wealth but a second chance. Yet we must ask ourselves, have we truly honored his memory? Have we learned the lessons he tried to teach us?" The villagers listened in silence, the weight of Paul's words settling over them. They had built monuments in Ben's honor and sung his praises, but deep down, many knew they still struggled to live up to his legacy. Martha, once known as the village gossip, was the first to speak. "We've changed," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "But not enough. We still judge people by their clothes, their possessions, their status. Ben showed us that worth is so much more than that. We need to do better, not just for him, but for ourselves." John, who had once been one of Ben's harshest critics, nodded. "Ben gave us everything," he said, his voice breaking, "and we repaid him with scorn until it was too late. I don't want my children to grow up in a village that forgets the value of kindness. We must be the kind of people Ben believed we could be." From that day forward, the villagers worked not only to preserve Ben's memory, but to embody the values he had lived by. They created programs to support the poor and the struggling, ensuring that no one in Amur would ever feel as isolated and unloved as Ben had. The school they built was named the Ben Memorial Academy, and every child who attended it learned his story as part of their education. Despite their efforts, the older villagers still carried the weight of their guilt. For them, no amount of good deeds could erase the years of cruelty and neglect that had defined their relationship with Ben. But in their sorrow, they found purpose. They became mentors to the younger generation, teaching them to value people for who they were, not what they had. Elder Paul, in his final years, often spoke of Ben as more than a man. "He was a mirror," Paul told the children who gathered at his feet. "He showed us the worst parts of ourselves. But he also showed us that we could change, that we could be better." One quiet evening, many years after Ben's death, a young boy named Peter sat by his grave. The boy was a student at the Ben Memorial Academy, and though he had never met Ben, he felt a deep connection to the man whose story had inspired him. "Thank you, Mr. Ben," Peter whispered, placing a flower on the grave. "You taught us to be kind even when it's hard. I want to be like you when I grow up." The boy's simple words carried far into the stillness of the evening, a testament to the lasting impact of Ben's life. His story had become more than a tale of sorrow. It was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of cruelty and hardship, kindness and integrity could prevail. Amur continued to thrive, its people forever shaped by the man they had once called Lazy Ben. His grave remained a place of pilgrimage, a silent witness to the transformation of a village that had learned, too late, the value of a single life. And though the wealth from the gold mine brought material prosperity, it was the lessons Ben left behind that truly enriched their souls. In the end, Ben's legacy was not in the gold that glittered beneath the hill, but in the hearts of those who finally learned to see the worth in every human being. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me.